Welcome to the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. My name is Cole DeSantis, and in today's video, we are having a roundtable discussion on the nature of the crisis in the church. And more specifically, we are going to be dealing with a variety of different topics concerning the cultural and historical intricacies that went into producing the crisis in the church and potential ways forward, and in particular, potential ways of trying to find really the best option for implementing the reforms of the council, maintaining a balance between tradition and reform, and all the myriad of topics that go into that. I'm joined today by some old friends, by some new friends. With me today is, starting right next to me, Bill Masur. William Masur is a revert to the Catholic faith. He's a father and husband. He is the founder of the Men of Character Conference, and he's an author. He's written the book of Uncomfortable Truths, A Guide to Navigating the Modern World and Forging Your Own Destiny. He's also contributed to Andrew Likoudis' book, Faith in Crisis, which came out, I believe, last year. Next to him is Charles Coulombe, poet, historian, theologian, social critic. He is currently doing some work with the Pelican Plus platform and has also worked as the in-house historian with Tumblar House publications. On the level below us, though certainly not least, is Andrew Mioni. He's a Catholic author. He's the founder of Trad Recovery and the author of the book Altar Against Altar, an Analysis of Catholic Traditionalism. He's also contributed to Andrew Likoudis' book, Faith in Crisis. And again, certainly last but not least, we have with us Andrew Likoudis, Catholic writer, apologist. He is the grandson of the Catholic apologist James Likoudis. He is the founder of the Likoudis Institute, or the Likoudis Foundation, which is an apologetical organization dedicated to sort of preserving the legacy of his grandfather. And he is the editor-in-chief of the book Faith in Crisis, which focuses on the crisis in the church since Vatican II, and in particular, the debates between traditionalists, liberals, and conservatives in the Catholic Church, and a lot of the questions associated with that. So I just want to thank you guys for joining me today, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to be here.
So I think the important place to begin with is, how do we define the crisis in the church? I think a lot of us have a sort of intuitive understanding of what the crisis in the church is. Vocations are down, church attendance is down, a knowledge of just general, even basic or essential Catholic doctrines is down. Obviously you see a culture that's becoming more and more out of step with Catholic and Christian values. And on the other hand, even if the moral issue wasn't in place, there's also been so many changes in the modern world that, frankly, it just raises so many theological questions about how to live the faith in this radically new environment. How do you maintain a balance between openness to tradition and also retaining tradition and openness to the promises of modernity. How do you maintain that balance? And so with that in mind, there's just so much stuff going on that people know that there's a crisis going on. But again, how do you define the crisis in the church? So without being overly reductionistic, let's maybe go person by person and really try to see if we can offer a definition of um, what is the crisis in the church before we can kind of create a framework about potential ways forward. So maybe we can start going clockwise from Bill to Charles and just sort of go from there.
Yeah. Maybe even my first thought was like the question almost is flawed, because I think that's part of the problem, right? Like the crisis is like a cultural, right? It's a modern crisis, and like the church lives in the world. We're all part of the world, and that cultural crisis is impacting the church, right? So it's almost like if you don't realize that the attack is actually from the outside, and you turn that around and you make it more about, well, it's the actual, not to say there's not bad actors within the church, but that it's only really something that's driven from within the church, then you sort of take a more adversarial stance potentially, right? And that's versus like, hey, there's, I think there, if you, I don't know, maybe it takes me back to Vatican II, but my reading is that the church was trying to address the crisis that they already saw brewing, but it was almost like we interpret it different, and we look back and say, well, that's what caused some of that rift. Everybody points to Vatican II, but it's like, well, maybe they just saw that coming, and maybe the impact of Vatican II obviously goes over decades and centuries. So trying to look at it from our point of view, we might sort of misinterpret the cause and effect of all that. So that was my thought, as you asked the question, is like, I think the world is in crisis, right? Even more so today, right? With what people look for information, how they approach authority, right? And all of those things impact the church. And I think it's more, if we approach it from a level, how maybe I approach it from a point of view of humility, of like, well, the church is also being harmed, and how do I help the church, right? And all the hierarchy, the laity, the entire church, versus trying to point fingers and saying this exact thing, and this document, this council, this bishop, this pope caused the crisis. It's like, it's a bit counterproductive, right? Yeah. There's one faith, so I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, and it seems like your point, I think, leads to a lot of interesting questions. I mean, obviously, as Catholics, we cannot hold to the opinion that the church can ever err, that the church can ever bind the consciences of the faithful in error. So obviously, and I don't think anyone here would say that Vatican II formally taught error, but I think definitely I've seen many scholars and theologians take the approach that it's not so much, again, an issue within the church, it's an issue in the modern world. But I guess this leads to sort of a broader question of, so Vatican II was attempting to confront, maybe in a manner different or more direct than the councils before it, some of the issues that that define modernity. But it seems like since the council, since the time when the church tried to like kind of go like deal more directly with these issues, it's been in that time that the faithful have sort of absorbed the worst possible elements of modernity, which ironically seems to be the opposite of what the council intended. The council wanted to try to take in the best of the modern world and use that to evangelize. So to the best of your ability to kind of, because I know that in itself is a complicated question, but why do you think that is? Why do you think there's a difference between what the council intended to happen and some of the reality on the ground concerning the people being sort of swept away? So even if the issue is not an issue with the church proper, but the issue is with the world, why do you think in that same period the church has been trying to bring about renewal, the sort of the church has been poisoned so much by the worst elements it was trying to push back against?
Is that question for me?
Yes, just to sort of elaborate upon your main point.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Maybe the only consoling answer that I have is like, clearly other councils, right? The Council of Nicaea, the first council, the church, right, declared doctrine, and that wasn't accepted, right? There were still Arians post council. So I don't know. I think it's like the church suffers like Christ suffers. So that's maybe my simple answer. Yeah, I don't know if I have a super astute answer to why exactly. I think we've had the same reaction as the majority of other faiths, right? Like, and maybe you could say we have less of a crisis, right? We haven't had some drastic change in the teachings of the church, right? There hasn't been, we still have a papacy, we still have bishops, like other faiths have diluted, right, into a much worse extent, right?
Yeah.
Where it's hard, you could hardly maybe recognize Christian, especially within the Christian denominations. So, but I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one if you want.
Sure, yeah.
I think what we have to consider when we're talking about the crisis of today is I think it can't be understated how radically and how significantly the 20th century changed the entire face of the world. We went from, obviously we had advancements in technology and industry and all this kind of stuff in the hundreds of years and thousands of years leading up to it. But the 20th century was just a complete nosedive. In some ways it was great, obviously, but in other ways, we've never been globally connected the way we are now, or even the way we were 100 years ago. We never had world wars before this, right? To that extent that that they happened then in the early 20th century. We never had the advancements in technology that we got in the 20th century. We never had instant communication. Everything is so different. Really, my thought is, thank God we called a council when we did, because I think if we waited any longer, we would have been in a much worse situation. And I think when we talk about defining the crisis, Pope John the 23rd specifically mentioned a crisis when he called the council in 1959. He said that the church is witnessing a crisis in the world right now. I have a quote directly from him. This is in his speech when he opened the Second Vatican Council. He said, it is a question, in fact, of bringing the perennial life-giving energies of the gospel to the modern world, a world that boasts of its technical and scientific conquests, but also bears the effects of a temporal order that some have wanted to reorganize by excluding God. This is why modern society is characterized by great material progress, but without a corresponding advance in the moral sphere. So we have such a hyper-focus on materialism, such a hyper-focus on progress, and we've kind of shut out any higher aspirations, I guess. He called it a militant atheism that is operating all over the world, right? And this is to a degree and to an extent that we really hadn't seen before. And so I think the reason Vatican II tried a different approach was to say, we can't come in here guns blazing and tell people what not to do and what's wrong and what is keep people in line. Obviously, there's the time and the place for that, but in the situation that we find ourselves in, what we have to do is a renewal and not a narrowing of the borders, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so that's actually a great point, because again, Vatican II, I think confronting the crisis of modernity is not a new thing. The church had been sort of doing this for at least a century to a century and a half before then, at least going back to, you could say arguably the French Revolution and the rise of modernism in the, late 18th, 19th century, possibly even older. So, but a lot of it is a difference in approach, trying to find a more, I don't want to say diplomatic, but maybe a more nuanced approach. But I guess this leads to the issue of, there is a crisis going on in society. So what do you say that the crisis in the church is not so much a crisis in the, well, like, would you agree with Bill's point that it's not really so much a crisis in the church proper as much as it is a crisis in society that the church is trying to confront, that maybe some leaders in the church haven't been dealing with as best as they could, and some people have thus kind of been swept away with the waters, in a sense, that so it's a crisis in the world and not in the church.
I would agree with that in like halfway, because I think you're right. It's a crisis in the world that has kind of bled into the church, right? And I don't think it's so much a matter of people with ill intent as it is maybe just underestimating how much that crisis had seeped in before we decided to do something about it. Because if you read the encyclicals of the late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of the problems that we identify today as being symptoms of this crisis, the popes have been calling this out for hundreds of years. This is not anything new. I mean, the very specific anecdote I like to give is, you hear stories about people who, people skip mass or whatever for to go to sports, or they skip mass to watch the sports or whatever. Pope Pius XI was chiding people about that in the 1930s. This is not a post-Vatican II thing. This is something that had been, this kind of obsession with modernity and obsession with our material satisfaction. I mean, this has been brewing for a very long time. And I think, again, it's not so much I don't think people got swept away by everything in the years immediately following. I think it had just been kind of lingering under the surface for a really long time, and it just kind of had an outlet to finally show itself. It was there all along. I think it just it needed a door to be opened to be let out. And personally, I think it's better that we opened that door and let it out and exposed it than letting it kind of simmer under the surface any longer than it had to.
Yeah. And so would you say that maybe before the council there was this notion that, like the meme of the dog sitting in the house and the house is burning down, and they're going, no, this is fine, this is good. So everyone just kind of was like, had a little bit of that mentality prior to the 1960s. And then in the 60s and 70s, would you maybe say that some of the clergy in the church were aware that there was some sort of crisis, and maybe it was negatively influencing the church, but they kind of didn't think it was as bad as it was? And then now they're in the young priests and the seminarians, the 60s and 70s, are now in charge, and now they're like, okay, now they're just kind of realizing it's stuff is not is more complicated than they thought.
I think that there's a distinct possibility of that. Yeah, that maybe they started to notice the rumblings, they started to see what was going on, and like I said, I think it's good that the magisterium tried to do something about it before it got too much worse, because if that council had been called in the 70s or 80s, with all the tumultuous historical events of those decades, I think we'd be in a much worse spot.
Yeah. And so to get a little bit of a slightly different perspective, let's move on to Charles. And I'd love to get your thoughts on the crisis in the church. I know, you tend to lean in a more traditional direction. And certainly the notion of the crisis in the church is something that I think most Catholics are aware of, and most Catholics have been very outspoken about. But obviously, the concept of the crisis in the church, at least as a phrase, I think is very widespread within traditionalist circles. And everyone kind of has a slightly different perspective on what the crisis in the church is, and the different elements of it. So, how would you define, in your understanding of recent church history, how would you define the crisis in the church, and what elements of sort of the definition that's kind of beginning to come into focus a little bit, what elements of that do you agree with, disagree with nuance,
Well, I think one thing that's important to understand about the background of the current situation is that from 1789, the church had fought sort of a running gun battle with modernity. I've got to agree with both Bill and young Andrew, or younger Andrew, older Andrew, forget it. Anyway, the one right under you. Anyway, the church had fought this sort of running gun battle with this new order and it primarily lost at every turn. Now, as part of this, you had the rise of Catholic social teaching in the 19th century, as the church attempted to deal with the changes in society at that time. But nothing quite worked. And then you had the two world wars that destroyed the last of the Catholic social order in Europe and damaged it elsewhere. And what you had left was a Soviet-American diarchy in the European heartland and to a degree over the globe. And this diarchy would not tolerate, really, either partner or either member would not tolerate the traditional Catholic state, the traditional Catholic social order, for very different reasons. In the Western half, however, you had, and this you'll see a lot in the writings of Pope Benedict, both before and after he was Pope, a lot of other people of the Communio school, the idea of a confessionally neutral state, nevertheless illumined by gospel values. Or to put it another way, Eisenhower's America. And by the time of the council, the optimists saw that as the future. The pessimists saw the Soviet Union as the future. And that was sort of the background. There were other things, of course, I'm wildly oversimplifying, but that was the background against which the council occurred. But in with and under all of that, there was something that Pope Benedict drew attention to in 2016, which I think ultimately is at the root of our problem. As he said in an interview with a Jesuit whose name escapes me, most Catholics cease to believe in the church as the means of salvation. And this had two results. One, it destroyed our evangelistic efforts because we have nothing to say to the world. And two, it kind of made it difficult to justify staying Catholic anyway, because if you don't need the church, you don't need it. Now, for me, where all of this in a certain sense came to a head was during COVID, where it seems to me three important realities were unveiled for everyone to gawk at, myself included. My joke at the time was that when they had us put on our masks, they took theirs off. And we learned, I think, three important lessons. One in the state, one in the church and state relations, and the third in the church herself. The first is that the modern state, the state under which we all live, is all powerful. It decides everything. It decides reality. What is true, what is false, what is right, what is wrong. And there is no appeal from that. It is what it is, and we serve our masters. Now, having said that, which would also explain why the fight for the levers of power has become so bloodthirsty, because you got that kind of power going with the state, you really want to grab it. The second thing we learned is that in terms of the notion of church and state, whereas even today many churchmen regard themselves as some sort of partners in some sense with the state. Not true. Not true at all. The church is like the garden club, or I don't know, the American Kennel Club, or the Kiwanis, the Rotary. In other words, an organization's nice for people who like that kind of thing, but to be regulated by the state along with every other element of life, and really without any meaning of its own. It's really not very important. And what we learned from the church in that time, although there were honorable and brave exceptions, the Archbishop of San Francisco comes to mind, the ordinariate parishes, a lot of other places, tried to stay open and function as well as they could. But for the most part, in most places around the globe, the state told the church to shut down, the church shut down, full stop. And although I was locked down in Austria with 8 priests, so I had all the sacraments I needed, so it wasn't my problem. But in Southern California, which I have an interest in, every one of my favorite parishes had on their website 3 things. Make a perfect act of contrition, as though that were the easiest thing in the world. Make a spiritual communion. Donate here. only one of these three was clickable, in case you were curious. Now, looking at all of that, where does that bring us? Well, it takes us back to the question of evangelization. If the church, and more importantly, her founder and her sacraments, are absolutely essential things, then it behooves us to evangelize any way we can, and any decent moral means of doing that is a good thing, whether it be the Chinese rites or guitar masses if they really worked. If they did the job, anything that brings people to the truth becomes a good thing. But on the other hand, if we don't really have the truth, or if it doesn't matter if we have the truth, or if everything's fine anyway, well, then none of it matters in any case. What's the point? And so, having said all of that, I look at a lot of the disputes that one sees in the church today as kind of missing the point entirely. I'm not saying they're not important at a particular level. I mean, I'm all for restoring the 54 Holy Week and on, but all to a purpose. And if that purpose isn't present, to bring souls to Christ, to evangelize, well, then what do we have? We have nothing. We have nothing to say to the world, except whatever you say, boss.
Yeah. And so it appears that there's, sort of two things going on at once. You've had, the world, I think, started to go crazy, and there's, I think, many a reason for that. And you could even maybe place some of the blame at the feet of the church. Not that the church caused it, but you could argue that the church didn't really do enough to curtail it in some sense. But either way, you saw things going crazy with the church, and for the past 150, 200 years, you've seen this battle between modernity, the worst elements of modernity, and the church. At the same time, I think, you have like what you pointed out, Charles, of people just sort of, in recent years, people just sort of acquiescing to people in the church acquiescing to the worst possible elements of modernity, and then divisions within the church about the best way to implement the reforms of the church, all of which, a lot of it is born out of more of like an obsession with a specific form of Catholicism rather than the truth as such. All of which, and the latter point seems to imply that the crisis in the church is really something's gone wrong in the church. And then the former notion, this perpetual battle between the church and the world, seems to imply that the onus is more on the world, and the issue, the crisis is really external. So if you really lean more towards that interpretation, why do you think you see things like a lot of an almost sectarian mindset among the different camps within the church? Why do you think you see the leaders of the church sort of acquiescing to the worst of modernity? And then if the issue is there's a crisis going on in the church, which I will admit is not as bad as among our friends in the Episcopal Church, let's say, thank God for that. But then how can you reconcile that with the notion that the church is indefectible? So where do you think the onus really lies in all of this?
That's a very fair question. I would say to begin with, Cardinal Ottaviani was asked at Vatican II if he could find any scriptural evidence for episcopal collegiality in the Bible, and he said, "Oh, sure," and they all fled. And that is certainly the first action by the body of Catholic bishops. The first public act of the first pope was to deny our Lord 3 times. So you have to remember that the church is always made up of human beings, and her indefectibility does not consist of the perfection of her members.
Yeah.
What it consists of is the means of perfection. The church will always make the means of salvation available, even if they seem as in all she had to offer was baptism and marriage, and that done by laymen. Even at that residual level, the church was still saving souls. That's where the indefectibility comes in. She will never attempt to bind her children with an untruth. One of the people who forget about papal infallibility is that it's really a negative quality. The Pope will not be able to bind the church with something that isn't true. It doesn't mean everything he's going to say is going to be true. I think that there are several things that will probably be defined one day because of the events of the past 20 years. And one of them is both the limits and the shape and the meaning of the ordinary magisterium, which really we all talk about. Nobody knows what it actually is. Nobody knows its frontiers, its real shape, what's in, what's out. The second thing is that one day there'll probably be a definition on the limits of papal authority. The Pope can't suddenly redefine the Trinity. Now, we all know that, but I think at some point it'll probably be explicitly stated. But to answer your question, I think a little more clearly, that's where the onus lies. Well, every age produces its own problems. One of the things that impressed me when I wrote a history of the popes was that it was always out of the frying. They get one crisis or more would be solved, and then another would arise. And very often, not always, very often the solution of the last crisis had the germs of the next problem.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the story of the church and the world until God ends it. But I will say, when you ask about the sectarianism, and that's a very good question. I always say, if you can read the four creeds that every Catholic is supposed to believe, Apostles, Nicene, Athanasian, Roman or Tridentine, or Pius IV, then you're a Catholic. And to that degree, then the rest of it, you and I may disagree, we have our problems, et cetera, but we're Catholics.
Yeah.
And that's more important than any of our, should be anyway, more important than any other question.
Yeah.
I had a great revolution in thinking back in the 1980s when I was, first really tackling church history in a serious way. I had thought growing up that the priests and so forth of our Lord's time were Pharisees. No, they weren't. They were Sadducees. They didn't believe in anything. They were not unlike most of the priests of my boyhood. And that was a big revelation to me. And I say this as a traditionalist, self-proclaimed. Yeah. If you wanted to identify the thing, well, we tried. The priests, the rest of them are like the Sadducees. I guess your liberation theologians would be kind of the zealots.
Yeah.
And then you've got kind of the mystical sorts who are Essenes. But I mention this because the problem, in one sense, there's the problem specific to our own day, of course. But the problem to maintain the faith and to bring it to the world is a perennial one. And sometimes we will make mistakes. In the case of the Chinese rites I mentioned earlier, the Malabar rites, with nothing to do with the Malabar rite, singular, of the church. In both cases, the missionaries attempted to fit local customs to fit the faith. In both cases, Rome initially said it's wrong. They condemned what they did. And then a couple of hundred years later, said, just kidding, actually, they were right. Those kinds of efforts, you are going to make mistakes like that. There's no way around it. And it's up to the magisterium, it's up to the make sense out of it. But because it's not covered by infallibility, they won't always get it right. But the point is they try.
Yeah.
I would say that there's the reason why you have this sort of sectarianism is the reason you always have it: a lack of faith and a lack of charity, and you might even say a lack of hope. That the lack of hope being that if things aren't solved my way, then obviously they're never going to be solved anyway, and the church was doomed.
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, I'm going to make a revelation that all 5 of you may disagree with me, or 4 may disagree with me violently. I'm not always right.
Yeah.
Sorry to break.
Well, I mean, that's darn it.
I know. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to have to learn this way. I apologize.
No. Well, it's okay. I mean, maybe one day you'll get elected pope and make the new great infallible Marian dogma, but one can only hope. But with that in mind, let's go on to Andrew, and maybe as he was the editor-in-chief of the book, so of his books, maybe he can sort of serve as an editor-in-chief here, maybe add his own opinions, maybe synthesize everything together. But what how would you define the crisis in the church? What is the crisis in the church? Is it a crisis in the world that the church has maybe not responded to as well? Is there something gone wrong within the church? I mean, what is the crisis in the church?
Yeah. I don't particularly like to frame it as a crisis in the church or in the world per se. I think there's mainly a crisis with how we as Catholics relate to the claims that our faith makes. I think with regard to indefectibility, for example, some people don't really, some people have never heard the term, but more to the point, like what the term entails is something that requires an act of faith. So the idea that the Pope and the church teaching at least, will not ever be able to lead souls astray. That's not a claim that all Catholics accept. A lot of Catholics probably have never even confronted the question. So there's an ecclesiological element missing from a lot of people's faith. They don't really they call themselves Catholic, they go to mass, they go through the motions, but there's no like real wrestling with this idea of like, what is the church there for? What role does the Holy Spirit take in guiding the church? And then what is my relationship to the church supposed to be in light of that? So I think it's especially difficult following on the heels of the abuse crisis, because that violated a lot of people's trust in the church's hierarchy. But regardless, the church still has a hierarchy that still has authority in matters of church teaching. So confronting this question in a way that doesn't sort of dismiss the problems that can happen when authority is abused, but also in a way that isn't dismissive of authority, is something that we need to face as a church. So I would say that's a main theme of my book, our book. But one of the other issues, and this is confronted in chapters throughout the book, in Bill's chapter especially, the relationship in America, where we have this individualism, this idea of trying to make our faith work around our political positions. So instead of putting faith as the primary element, your politics comes first, and then your faith comes somewhere downstream from that. So Bill can tell you more about it, but that's another big issue I see. And on top of this, I think with the council, just from a historical point of view, we had the council, which caused a lot of confusion. There's the fact that before the council, there was a real lack of catechesis. Andrew talks about this in his book, Altar to Altar, I think, where it's like the part of the reason the council was called was because people were going through the motions. There was this functionality at play, which didn't. What do you say? There's two terms you used, and it's
it was there's functional spirituality and spiritual functionality, and they kind of intersect.
Yeah, exactly. So the council kind of wanted to address that. A lot of the liturgical reform. That's why the main element of Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy, is active participation, because it really wanted to get people more involved with understanding and living the faith, and so active participation in the liturgy, and then the call to holiness of all believers was a major principle of all the documents. So really highlighting that Catholics need to be better catechized. They need to engage more in active ministry. And then also there was a need to, like, not de-spiritualize your faith, but to make it more incarnate. So it wasn't just the salvation of souls, it's also liberating captives and lifting up the downtrodden and serving the poor, etc. And there's been a lot of confusion, especially in America, again, because of our cultural sort of closeness to evangelical Protestantism and fundamentalism, which sort of dismisses this practical element of the faith, which is doing the works of mercy and living the gospel. So it's not just what do I believe, but it's also what do I do with that. On top of this, and this is the last point I'll make, following the council, there was a lot of confusion because of the way mass media depicted the council and the reforms, and so there was a lot of false representation of the council. There was a lot of, like, throwing out of altars and altar rails and all this. There's reasons for certain reforms that happened regarding the liturgy, which were legitimate, like moving the tabernacle. That's actually in the documents produced after the council. That's a specific reform that was called for. But most people don't know that. So there's like rogue priests doing whatever they want in the liturgy, and then there was a reaction to that. And sometimes it was an overreaction, which tended to undermine the actual liturgical reform. And so the way that we've implemented the council has been full of stops and starts. And then also with the liberal dissenter crisis in the 70s and 80s with Charles Curran and Hans Kung, there's been sort of a reaction to that, which was healthy, and then there's been like a doubling down, which has sort of been an overreaction to condemning healthy theological ideas, which people associate with liberal theology or modernism, for example. So I don't know what the solution to all, because it's a lot, but we need to confront these things, and sort of, I think dialogue's the best way to do that. So I'll just leave off with that.
So what do you say? It seems like, in your view, probably the biggest issues so it seems like the issue is primarily again a crisis caused by modernity that then sort of seeped into the church mainly due to things like lack of proper catechesis or misplaced priorities, like allowing the culture to dictate how we live the faith rather than having the faith dictate how we live in the culture. Like that sort of stuff is really like
Well,
what the crisis in the church, quote unquote, is.
yeah, well, it's interesting. One of the things that I've come to realize is that the extremes on both sides, they fall to the same error, which is theological liberalism at root. Some kind of like subjectivism with regard to what I'll accept as true, and it's basically like deciding for yourself what the church has authority to speak on because of some subjective markers that I've set for what counts as orthodox or for where the limits of the church's authority lie. So, for example, with contraception, it was Charles Coulombe saying basically that experience and scientific advancement and historical studies have made previous church teaching obsolete. And then on the other side, with like the change to the death penalty from Pope Francis and the reaction to that, it was people saying the church can't change this because we've had this for 2,000 years. So, but again, it's where does that authority lie? It didn't lie with Charles Curran, but it does lie with the church. And so the reactions on both sides to when the church came out and condemned contraception, and when the church came out and condemned the death penalty, the reactions to both of those teachings have been stemming from the same theological error of liberalism.
And that I think actually touches on a very like interesting point that I'd like to expand on, because now that we've kind of like gotten everyone's input on what the crisis in the church is, I think now it's important to kind of maybe talk a little bit about some historical elements of it, like what some of the root causes. Now we could obviously talk all night about the potential causes of the crisis in the church, but I think there's a few key points I think would be particularly interesting to discuss. And you had talked a little bit about this, Andrew, with this notion that the radical extremes of the traditionalist movement and some of the radical extremes of the liberalism within the church are born out of the same mindset, namely, sort of a sort of theological liberalism and subjectivism. And I think that goes back to a point that Bill raised in his chapter on your book when he talks about one of the causes of the current crisis in the church is sort of Americanism. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about this, Bill, and then we can kind of open it up to more general discussion. But you had actually defined Americanism in a very interesting way. A lot of the resources that I read, a lot of it comes out of more traditionalist publications, and it defines Americanism as sort of like a branch of liberalism, as a sort of thing about like this 19th century notion of instead of authentic enculturation, instead of using the best in the culture as a means to express the faith and expressing the faith in terms of the best of the culture, it's this notion of just sort of putting your stamp of approval blindly on the whole culture, and it's just the church assimilating into the culture, which it gets its name from the fact that this happened a lot in America, with people saying the Constitution is a fundamentally Catholic document, and then which meant that people weren't just internalizing the most Catholic elements of American culture, they were sort of internalizing a type of like Enlightenment liberal mindset. And so the church had to respond to that. So, but most people think when they think of Americanism, they think of Americanism as a sort of subset of liberalism or modernism. And Bill, in your book, in Faith in Crisis, you define Americanism in sort of broader terms as this sort of mindset of each individual kind of has a sort of, or like the church in each part of the world kind of has its own radical autonomy, and we kind of get to, like, each individual is sort of like, get to determine for themselves what the Catholic faith sort of means for you. And so if you can speak a little bit more about what Americanism is, and why you think a form of Americanism is kind of at the root of both liberalism and the more radical forms of traditionalism.
Yeah, well, I don't know. If you look at the history of the United States, right, we're sort of born out of protest. So there's this just natural reaction to rebel against authority. So I think that definitely has, and then right, Protestantism, the same thing. And you look at the country's founding is very driven by Protestants. So we over time, I think that influence for sure influences Catholics right within the United States. So that tendency to want to place reason maybe above authority, right? Our own reason. And so I think that for sure, in my own experience, right, I sort of came to certain political conclusions, right, in my own sort of political evolution. And then Catholicism, like, sort of fit, right? Like a lot of the things that I already believed were aligned. And so instead of like me coming to the faith and having to put behind certain beliefs because they, instead of having conversion, I was almost choosing something that best fit me. And so I think, Andrew brings up the death penalty. I think that's a good example. I was pro-death penalty before I became Catholic. And then when I finally sort of submitted to the authority of the papacy and the church, realized, well, okay, I'm wrong about that. And I think a lot of people have, especially in America, have trouble with that, right? That admitting that their own conclusion maybe is wrong and that they have to submit to a higher authority sort of goes against our ethos as Americans.
I think you're muted, Cole, or something.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. Again, damn technology. But anyways, again, the costs of modernism. Like, no, anyways, but
No.
but anyways, so I think the events of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s really bring to light this notion of, like, it's easy to see how this Americanist mindset can kind of play out in liberalism, right? But I think when people think of traditionalism, they think of, well, you got to just do whatever the priest tells you to, and then these images of, we want to revive like the Pope, what he used to be in his glory. And so people don't really think of Americanism as leading to sort of this radical form of traditionalism. So can you elaborate upon that? I've heard some people kind of speculate that maybe a radical form of traditionalism is not sort of authentic traditionalism, but it's kind of a perversion of it. It's sort of the opposite under the guise of traditionalism. And it's really like masking certain tendencies that are the opposite of traditionalism. And I think that's kind of a little bit of what you've argued. So what would you say about that?
Well, maybe the main part is like that, the treating the church authority as optional, right? Not having the proper respect and sort of submission to that and obedience to that. And I think it comes back to, right, our own politics in America. So, and the other part is the focus more on the active virtues over the passive virtues, right? Like the act of protesting, activism, productivity, right? These things that Americans value, which aren't necessarily bad things, but placing them maybe over the more passive virtues that the church values of humility, right, and obedience. So, I think that's in many ways why our politics are so much more entertaining than maybe, or at least it seems that way as an American. And we want to, what can we do to? I remember reading during the Pope Francis pontificate, right? People debating like how we could pressure the Pope. What political maneuvering could we do to like pressure him to have to make a decision? And just the whole basis of it, right, is sort of ridiculous if you think about it. Like there is no pressuring the Pope. Like he's teaching you. So, and he's the one trying to articulate the faith for right, and the bishops as well for our modern age. So, it's really that, right? It's almost like trying to take the right, placing also like the traditions of the church and trying to separate that from the authority of the church, right? The same way that Protestants maybe separate, scripture from the authority and tradition of the church. Like you can't have those things without the others.
Yeah. And so maybe let's open this up to discussion. Any thoughts, input that people would like to contribute? Anything anyone would like to push back on, nuance, expand upon?
I promise I'm not doing this as a plug, but this entire conversation is pretty much the premise of my book that just came out, which is about the Oh, there we go. Yeah, Andrew was kind enough to endorse that one for me, so thank you again. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention as I was saying earlier, how it goes back. This whole idea of the crisis goes back hundreds of years, and I think ultimately at its root, as we've been talking about the last little bit here, it is a crisis of authority. It is a crisis of recognizing and submitting to authority. And I think the magisterium has been about as explicitly clear on that as one could ask for. I think Vatican I made it very clear what led up to the crisis that really came to a head in the 20th century. But going all the way back to the time immediately after Trent, I mean, really it began at the Reformation, I think is kind of the when the seed was planted, right? Because then you get, private interpretation of scripture. Then you get, what's the trajectory that they took it on here? And this is all in session 3 of Vatican I, where basically they said you go from private interpretation of scripture, which is a rejection of the church's authority, that leads you to religious indifferentism, that leads you to well, if I'm calling the shots here, if I'm making decisions, then anything goes, because ultimately it's my call. Once you're down that path, you get into naturalism, you get into materialism, you get into spiritual apathy, and that's what ultimately led to, again, what John the 23rd called militant atheism, was just this several hundred years of a very slow but widening rejection of the church's authority. And that's how we got to the point that we are today. And I think that might be why the church is not quite so fire and brimstone as maybe some of her members would like her to be. This is why the church didn't come out swinging with anathemas and condemnations in Vatican II, because Vatican I issued, I think it was close to 24 anathemas, most of them having to do with divine revelation and this kind of thing. And I don't want to paint with a broad brush here, but it seems to me that it did little to nothing to slow the spread of the crisis into the 20th century. Pope Pius IX was a pretty intense guy, and I think he was. Vatican I meant business, but I don't know how much it did to really address the root of the problem. And we can discuss or speculate, but that's just my take on it.
I think you've got also another problem, and that is that those who wield authority are human beings, and as human beings, they're products of their time. I may be the only one of the 5 of us who lived through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and I can tell you that, for instance, the rejection of the teaching a couple of theologians, it was whole bishops' conferences. In Austria, where I live now, the Austrian Bishops' Conference declared quite explicitly you didn't have to accept Humanae Vitae. The same was true in Canada and Belgium and elsewhere. And this was never addressed, you see. This was never dealt with. This was accepted. This was fine. Not a big deal, not a difficulty. And it remains the case today. Don't get me started on Germany. I have a standard answer to German theologians, when they start yapping about some heresy or other. My answer is, I see, Father. So what you're saying is we have to abolish the church tax. Ends the conversation immediately. There's nothing more than that. But the archetypal, to me, crisis of authority in the church's history. I mean, I'm speaking of an incident now, a specific incident that's worth thinking about, because it was such a challenge at the time, and it remains a challenge now, even to the question of indefectibility, which, believe me, I accept. Indefectibility, I mean, not the challenge. And that is the so-called cadaver synod. Now, everybody's heard of that. Stephen VI had the body of Formosus dried up. The reason why everybody's heard of it is because it's disgusting. But that was not the important point, really, of that synod. It wasn't his dragging up the corpse, although we remember it because of that. It was his judgment, Stephen VI's judgment. The basic thing at issue was that Pope Formosus was the first bishop of another city ever to be made Pope of Rome. All his predecessors had been priests elected and then consecrated Bishop of Rome and so forth. Formosus was supported by a political group in the city. He dies, their opponents take over, they put in Stephen VI. Stephen VI has this trial, he has his predecessor's body brought up. He makes two judgments, both of which were wrong, but the second of which, even by those standards then, was actually heretical. And here they are. The first was that because he had been bishop of another city, he had never been valid pope. Now, of course, if that were true, we'd have a lot of problems today. The Sede Vacantis missed the bus a long time ago. But the second is that because he was not legitimate pope, none of his sacramental ministrations while pope were valid. All the bishops he had consecrated, and all the priests he had ordained, were not bishops and priests. Well, as you might guess, there was some comment upon it, but it was suppressed very quickly. A few more pontificates go by. The next pope says, just kidding. Not true. Formosus really was the pope, but of course, it was all valid. Okay, a few more pontificates go by. The other side get in, and they bring in Pope Sergius III, who declares, not, just kidding. Stephen was right, and Formosus was never pope, and so forth. Well, why is this important? It's important because part of the tests of our faith is that the very actions of that authority. It's not the Oracle of Delphi. That's the thing you've got to bear in mind. You have to strike always a balance between faith in the sense, in a very real sense, has to be dominant, because at the end, that's what our salvation depends upon, not our own personal infallibility. But we can never leave out historical reality out of these issues. And people tend to, on both sides. And as an historian, I can say that to me, the truth of Catholic authority, the truth of the papacy is crystal clear, despite all of the many things you could cite against it. And that's paradoxical, I suppose. But you see, this is why we have levels of solemnity in teaching. Everything is not everything. Everything the Pope says is not infallible. Everything authorities do are not correct. If they were, then the Chinese rites would have been accepted the minute they came out and not condemned and then vindicated a couple of centuries later. These unfortunately, so we can never escape the use of our minds. And then, if we're wrong, then we have to accept the consequences. And that's true even if we are in positions of authority. I remember Pope John the 22nd, one of my favorites, he declared that, and incidentally, he was the one to whom Our Lady gave the Sabbatine privilege. Kind of funny that. But he declared that the just will not see God until the final judgment. That's not true. He imprisoned several people who disagreed with him. He accepted the truth on his deathbed. And of course, it hadn't been defined by that time. It was defined, as you might say, in his the reign of his successor. I bring that in not to rain on the parade or anything, but just to remind us all that these things take a great deal of thought, a great deal of discretion. You can't leave the historical record out. You can't make it supreme either. Historicism is the opposite era, where everything's historically conditioned. So you can disregard it all because, we live in a different period. These are very, very difficult matters. And like the second Andrew or the older Andrew, there's so much to it. It boggles the mind. I wish I had a handy-dandy answer for it all.
And it's interesting. I had a professor when I remember it was a while ago in my freshman year of college. I had a professor in history who taught American history, and again, like I said, the only thing that proved to be more complex in American history was European history. It's like every part of the world is, in a competition to see who's, can have the most messiest history. But of course, everyone likes to talk about how bad things are in American politics now, and they look at American history and they realize just how messy it was in the past. And my professor at that time said, "We've been here before, and we're going to be there again." Whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's an issue, we can't act like this is the first and only time it's ever happened. And that, in a sense, is a consolation, because if you made it through before, we can make it through it again. But I guess this then leads to I think a bigger issue that Charles is trying to raise, which I think leads to a broader question that I guess is also like the second main point, kind of to switch gears a little bit and kind of go from talking about the past to talking about the future. I guess there's a balance. There's sort of progressivism, the notion that we need to move past, history, or we need to move past tradition, and then you have antiquarianism, which is, in some forms could sort of lead to back into liberalism. In other forms, sort of leads into fundamentalism, like taking church history as it existed in one point in time and saying that's the end all and be all. This, I guess, leads to a broader issue of the importance of tradition. So obviously, there were issues in the church, there were issues in the world, and the church needed a form of like spiritual renewal to be able to confront it. The problem is that this wasn't meant to contradict tradition, and so basically, it was meant to give us a better way of implementing tradition in the modern world. And so this sort of leads to like the debate that emerges from Vatican II, and I think is defining of the crisis of the church, and that's how do you balance tradition and the need for reform? And once we strike that balance, I think it'll be a lot easier to sort of move forward with the theological project of Vatican II. But with that in mind, I guess I'd like to, maybe we could talk a little bit about what is tradition and how do you define tradition in such a way so it doesn't leave out the possibility of reform when reform is necessary? And then how do you define reform in such a way so as to not have that become basically just liberalism, progressivism, and that allows us to preserve and, in a sense, enhance and protect tradition?
Bill?
I could start.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
So I think the first crucial distinction to make is between tradition with a capital T and lowercase t traditions. Tradition with a capital T is, of course, the transmission of the faith by the apostles, and tradition in that sense ended with the death of the last apostle. The deposit of faith is it's scripture and tradition. Tradition is one of those elements, and our traditions today are expressions of that one deposit. So traditions today are an expression of the tradition of our faith, in concrete historical forms. Those can always be reformed, modified, abandoned even, at the discretion of the church's authority, who is tasked with safeguarding the deposit and expounding it clearly for the faithful. Dave Verbum of Vatican II on Divine Revelation says that the deposit, well, John the 23rd says this at the beginning of the council. He says the deposit of faith is one thing, the way it is expressed is another. And Dave Verbum kind of repeats that, but it also says the church even comes to a better understanding of the deposit over time. And this understanding, this developed understanding, determines the expressions that the church implements in any historical period.
I'll jump, kind of take that and run. Pope Benedict XV said back in the 19 teens, I think it was in 1914, in one of his encyclicals, he said very, very bluntly, old things, but in a new way. And I think that's the approach that I would say the church attempted to take. How well it executed it can obviously be discussed and debated, but I think we were trying to take the longstanding traditions and present them in a way that, as we've been saying kind of throughout this whole conversation, that the world had changed so much and so fast in such a short period of time that I think the church knew it was important to have that capital T tradition anchor, so that people didn't get blown away in the wind, but also that with the changing circumstances and the changing environment and all these new challenges that people were facing in the going into the 21st century, especially going into the digital age, that there was going to need to be a more effective way of transmitting that. And I think that's where as Andrew mentioned earlier, the full active conscious participation of the Mass comes in. I know that's a very hotly debated phrase, topic, whatever, that there's a lot of discussion on what exactly that means, but it seems clear, for example, that and I'm not trying to get into the liturgy wars here, but it seems to me that if the church pretty unanimously agreed that we need to reform the liturgy so as to facilitate full active conscious participation, that kind of implies that wasn't there beforehand, or at least not to the degree that the church wanted it to be, in order for the faithful to glean the proper spiritual fruits from the liturgy. And now I know that's opening up a very large and very messy can of worms, and I won't go too far down that topic. But I'm reminded of there's a quote, or a quote from a cardinal whose name escapes me right now, who said that something about the new theology of the new missal, right? And people take issue with that phrase. But Joseph Ratzinger was saying the same thing back in 1962-63, before the council. He was saying that there needs to be a new theology of divine worship. We can't just remove a couple of gestures and add a couple prayers and change up a couple small things. He said that would make it a very superficial renewal. It needs to be a full renewal. People need to understand the theology behind it. And I think, yeah, just with so much that people were having to deal with, so is all these new challenges that the modern world is bringing on, that that the church was trying to say, we're keeping, as I said, the capital T tradition of worship, liturgy, the Roman Rite, while modifying those things that it deems necessary to modify, as I believe it's Mediator Dei specifies. And I know I kind of took that on a bit of a tangent, but that was just the first thing that came to mind.
Right.
I want to add something, and I probably should have added this earlier when I was defining the crisis, but it's also a misunderstanding about modernity itself. If you're modernizing something, a lot of people have equated that with modernism, the heresy, and that's just a category error. The term modernism as a heresy has a specific historical connotation. It deals with religious subjectivism and making your experience of the faith the primary thing in your faith. So that's a specific heresy that was mostly, I would say, dealt with by the time Vatican II rolled around. There was even an overreaction to the point where Orthodox theologians like Henry de Lubac were being censured, or at least investigated, because they were deemed maybe too ambitious in their efforts at creating a bridge between the faith and the modern world. And there were some other issues, the nature and grace debate, which he was investigated for, but ultimately he was vindicated, of course. And but yeah, the main point is that modernization is not antithetical to the faith. Reform is certainly not antithetical to the faith. And it doesn't, there's often this polemic thrown out that if something needs reform, that means the previous thing that came before is like wrong or deficient in some way, and therefore shouldn't have been practiced. But I think that's also a mistake, because you can have a less optimal like model of your iPhone, and then a new iPhone comes along that's better, but that doesn't mean the old one was not the best that you could have had at the moment. So there's this constant deepening of our understanding of the faith over time. So development's a real thing. And then to the point about the liturgy, I just want to throw this in there. There was a very long period between Trent, which is the last major reform, and Vatican II. So there was a whole lot of theological development that happened that needed to be incorporated into that reform, which made the reform seem so drastic, because if you're only updating, it seems like you're going from like iOS on your iPhone, like iOS 3 to iOS 18. It's not it's a big jump, but you wouldn't say, well, let's just jump to 4, like iOS 4, even though 18 is available. It's a steeper learning curve, but yeah.
And so I guess this leads to a question of what are the exact principles that we keep in mind. I guess this raises a sort of twofold question. So what are the principles that we keep in mind to prevent reform from being like throwing the baby out with the bathwater? And at the same time, what are the principles that we keep in mind to know how and in what way and which parts of tradition maybe need to be reformed? Maybe that's too broad of a question, because that also, in many ways, it's circumstantial. but obviously the church has had to go through reforms before. Like I said, this is not the first time, and this will not, obviously be the last time that we have to deal with this. But I mean, I guess this is something that, maybe I think if we had a clearer view on this, would maybe help us move forward in the faith. So
I just like to say that I'll take you back to Benedict XVI in that interview. What does the church exist for? The salvation of souls. That's the first thing. If you study canon law, what is the first law of the church? The salvation of souls. That's all she exists for. She has no other reason to be here. Without that, and for the vast majority of us, as Pope Benedict said, we've lost that sense entirely. She has no reason to exist. All the questions that we raised, all that, it is, if you'll pardon my using an overused metaphor, it's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And not only that, a Titanic that's in port and hasn't actually gone anywhere. So I think the first thing we'd have to regain is a sense of the church as the means of salvation, of her sacraments is absolutely essential. Because then, there's not only is there a point to it all, there's a direction. There's a reason that we do these things. I'll tell you, again, I lived through the great changes. They were imposed with great brutality, with absolutely no pastoral regard. You'll do as you're told, warm boy. That was not conducive to the salvation of souls because that sense had already been lost. I'll put this another way. Let's pretend you're a priest. And let's pretend for a minute that you've got a meeting with the bishop. You really do. This isn't a golf game or something. You really have to go see the bishop. Somebody comes to your door and wants to go to confession. All right, you really can't. You don't have the time for it. You just don't. Well, if you think that what the mumbo jumbo stuff you do is absolutely essential to his soul, then you'll be very gentle and you'll say, well, look, I really can't do it. Here, let me call Father Oblivion over at the next parish. And you go right over there. Hold on a minute. You call, you explain the situation, off he goes. Because you feel that what you're doing is essential. Now let's pretend, hard to believe, but let's pretend you don't. Look, I'm sorry, I gotta go. Come back Saturday or make an appointment with my secretary. Bye-bye. That man may never knock on the door of your church again. But that's not really important to you. It's not consciously unimportant to you. I mean, you're not thinking buzz off. But that's the result of your basic mindset. I mean, the very notion that you have with so many dioceses today of, managed decline. Whenever I hear that phrase, I want to strangle someone. Managed decline, is that all it is? Well, it is, in fact, and I have no right to be angry if the church is not the means of salvation. She's just an organization of whatever. In that case, yeah, why not? What's wrong with that? Nothing. So, again, I recommend Benedict's interview to you all because it's fascinating, and he of course takes on our old friend Karl Rahner, who tells us that we're all members of the church unconsciously, and that's great. I wish I could be sometimes. If I could get me some of that anonymous Christianity, let me tell you, I'd be happy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would make a lot of things easier, you know.
Oh, I'll tell you, and it'd be cheaper on Sundays.
Well, wouldn't miss as many NFL games, you know.
Yeah.
Though I wouldn't have to watch the Patriots lose so badly, but anyways, I had to bring that up. Anyway, but it seems as if that's actually a good point because, God is truth, right? And so if God is the source of all truth, and if tradition, capital T tradition, is one of the ways in which divine revelation is passed on, and if lowercase t tradition is to be accepted insofar as it is in line with capital T tradition and scripture, would it make sense to say that how we know if something is in line with tradition is if it is conducive? Because if God is the source of truth, then anything that's in line with the truth leads to our salvation. So you know if something is a part of tradition if it is conducive to salvation, and the best way to interpret and implement tradition is it conducive to salvation? So how you know whether or not a part of the tradition is in need of reform, to what extent or in what way is it conducive to salvation, and what we know about the basic principles of salvation. Is that a point you would agree with? Do you think that's an oversimplification? Do you think?
I don't think it's oversimplified. I think it's quite true. I mean, tradition with a small t, of course, can develop out of almost nothing. It just gets, for something happens, it gets repeated over and over and over. You know, it's a funny thing, but before Vatican II, every day the Pope would sign a renunciation of any liturgical errors he might have made during the course of the day, for fear that they would be seized upon as precedents. And, you know, I read that. I'll tell you what. I thought, no, this whoever came up with that rule understood human psychology very well. It certainly it also, though, speaks to accept a certain healthy lack of uniformity, if you get what I mean. In other words, every region, every place has its own particular genius, such as it is, its own particular emphasis. We have, especially since, in response to liberalism in the 19th century, even before, since Trent, there has been a huge drive in the Western Church, not the Eastern, for complete liturgical uniformity. And yet, it didn't really exist even in, say, 1930 or 1910. It didn't exist. There were subtle differences, and if you knew what they were, they all came about because of the local conditions, the way people were, the way people did things. And they were great. They suited the temperament of that people. They kept them in touch with their own particular version of Catholicism. And multiply that by the Eastern rites 1,000 times more. I'm a member of the Ordinariate, actually. I'm one of the very few cradle Catholic members of the Ordinariate. And I can tell you it's been something to watch its creation and something to watch the Anglican patrimony, as Pope Benedict put it, properly reshaped to fit the church. And it was an interesting combination of things because the Anglo-Catholics in the 19th century drew on two sources. One was the English medieval tradition, much of which had been lost amongst Catholic Englishmen. And the other were contemporary Catholic practices of the time, which have been lost today, but in most of the Latin rite. And these were the things that Pope Benedict specifically charged them with keeping, not from the standpoint of some sort of antiquarianism, but because they're actually useful and they work. Similarly, I made reference to the pre-55 Holy Week rites. It's interesting that the impulse to bring them back has not been clerical, not at all. It's been entirely from laity. And having experienced the difference, I understand why. Again, in a lot of these things, what is it St. Vincent of Lerins said? In essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. That's a phrase that we tend to forget. And I mean, mutatis mutandis, I'm on the one hand, I'm a great fan of the canonization of Blessed Karl of Austria. I'm also a fan of the canonization of Dorothy Day. Now, weren't they terribly? No, they weren't terribly different. Their circumstances were, their callings were, their ways of living the faith were, but they were witnesses to the same undying truth in the particular circumstances in which they found themselves. one of the, to me, most unjust criticisms of John Paul II was that he made too many saints. Well, okay, most of the saints that he canonized were huge groups of martyred Catholics, because the 20th century was the bloodiest up until this one that there had been. And you had these huge numbers of Catholics murdered, and he, as martyrs, they were worthy of canonization. This is a total side note I've jumped down, but I think we should all rejoice whenever anybody gets canonized. It means, gosh, another one of us finally made it, thank God. With every one of them that's canonized, there's more hope for me.
Yeah. No, I could say the same thing, but it seems like that's an interesting point, sort of the last point that you raised of, it seems as if before Vatican II, I think there were a lot of issues in the pre-conciliar church that there was a need for reform. But I think, ironically, the pre-Vatican II church contains some nuggets of that could be kind of used as role models today. I mean, there was a lot of each individual attains holiness according to their status, which is why you see, just taking the 20th century, literally probably 3/4 of the popes from the 20th century are either saints or they're on the path to sainthood. But you see someone like Dorothy Day and the Blessed Carol of Austria are also on the path to sainthood. So you see this notion of each individual living out holiness according to their station. You see the forms of enculturation that you had seen in the past. So think about the difference between Eastern and Latin Rite Catholicism, or think about people appealing to or accommodating the best or most Catholic elements of a culture. Do you think that I've always entertained the thought of, if only we could find a way to sort of do that on a larger scale, more systematic level, that it would be a lot, that we wouldn't be facing so many of the issues that we face today, that Vatican II would be so much, would have been implemented in such a better way had we've done some of those. So is this something a thought that any of you guys have had, or do you think that I'm oversimplifying? Do you think I'm coming out of left field? But I do kind of feel like there's the best of the pre-conciliar church. If we had done a better job at sort of doing it in a more systematic and larger scale level, we wouldn't be facing so many of the issues. Or do you think?
Well, if I could just say very quickly with that, my confessor when I was in high school was Cardinal McIntyre, who was at the council. We talked about it a lot. And, part of the problem, again, the members of the church, the authorities of the church are people who are products of their own time. And in some ways, what I remember is the council being enforced, shall we say, with all the worst elements of the pre-conciliar church's doing of things, or as my dad described somebody as a post-Vatican II, a pre-Vatican II tyrant with post-Vatican II ideas, which summed up the Monsignor in question beautifully. But the problem also that you had, as Benedict says, there were three different councils, the Council of the Documents, the Council of the Press, and then the so-called Spirit. And about that, we used to joke that it was the only time in history where the Spirit killed the letter. To that. Beyond that, it's a long time ago. You guys will, all of you, likely see something I won't, which is the centennial of Vatican II.
And hopefully on the centennial of Vatican II, hopefully there's a lot of things we would have gotten right by that point. But, would anyone else like to add anything, or does anyone have any thoughts, anything they'd like to, any historical notes, theological notes?
One one thought that I've been having as we've been having this discussion is like, we talk about the modern world, but like, what's really driving? And I think Charles is right, that we're not actually placing the importance of the church in the salvation of souls. And why is that? It's like we've reached a level of, and I'm sort of simplifying this for maybe the Western world, but a level of comfort, right, and convenience where the church seems unnecessary, right? If you just live in the sort of physical world of your day to day, it doesn't seem like all of that is necessary. And then and that's backed up by other denominations, right? Protestants that believe you just, right, faith alone, Jesus alone. So we've almost like been lulled to sleep, right? And I would say that's both, the laity and the clergy, right? The hierarchy. So I do think the renewal, it is like an individual one, right? Like what can we do as individual Catholics? If we actually believe that the church is essential to the salvation of souls, then how do we more actively participate in the life of the church, right? In our own vocation, as a part of the, as a parishioner, or as clergy, whatever our role is. So that's something that I think I've thought a lot about, right? I'm a revert to the faith, but I almost view myself more as like a convert, right? When I was a kid, I got first communion, I was baptized, but I didn't believe, right? So it wasn't until I reverted that I fully believed. And so I do get sometimes not discouraged, but I am a little sad, right? When I sense a little indifference, right? Or like people not truly understanding the grace and the blessings that we have through the church. And I think the only way that you can convince people of that, is like love and truth, right? It's like actually living out the faith. And so, yeah, maybe for better or worse, the church and society in general, we went through sort of a period of indifference and malaise where we were convincing ourselves we didn't need the church. But, we mentioned COVID. That shook me pretty well. And I realized, like, okay, there's something bigger going on here. I need to, fully know for certain what I believe about God and what that means and where the truth is. And I think a lot of people are having that same, experience, right, in the last 5-6 years.
Yeah. And I actually don't want to add something, or
I have two seemingly disconnected thoughts that I'm going to try to intertwine because I think they do relate. And I'm gonna start with Bill and Charles. Both of you mentioned COVID and the realizations that brought. And I think in hindsight, there was a lot of consternation about the fact that churches were closed while businesses were open, and to some people, to a lot of people I knew, it seemed like this this conspiracy that the government was persecuting the church or whatnot. And I think a couple of years with that behind me and studying that issue, it's like I think it's much simpler than that. I don't think it's that there was any kind of conspiracy or any kind of ill intent. It's just the fact that we live in a very materialistic, functional world. As I was saying with Andrew earlier, with this where functionality is the ultimate end goal of everything. The government didn't let churches open because they didn't serve any function, because they didn't bring in any money, because they didn't contribute to anything. There was.
It's like the YMCA. It's like
right. It's for people to. It's a nice thing for people to gather and feel good together, but it doesn't further any. It doesn't. There's no tangible, measurable
benefit. There's no tangible benefit.
Right. Exactly.
It's a nice thing for people who have that kind of neurotic little need. It's quaint.
Right.
Right. I mean, they got rid of community dances too.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it just this whole thing made me think of a quote, kind of Charles, just bouncing off of your going back to Benedict XVI, who's one of my favorite popes. He has this quote where he says, and the exact wording is escaping me, but essentially says, we just look at the in our day and age, we look at the function of a thing. We look at what can I do with it. We no longer look at what is it, right? And I think that is the trap that I think a lot of us fall into today. Is speaking about the church. What can I do with the church? What can the church do? How can I? What purpose can it serve? And not what is it, right? We don't understand what the church is. That the church is the body of Christ. That we all make up the body of Christ, right? And it's not just a matter of ticking some boxes and doing my weekly my weekly contribution, and I go to confession once a month, and I do this, that, and the other thing, and it's not a matter of pattern or routine, although those things are certainly good. It's a matter of like Charles said, really understanding what the church is, how she operates, understanding what that means for us as individuals, and how that affects our relationships with other people. And I think that is maybe some of the groundwork we need to keep in mind for your question, Cole, about moving forward is, just understanding that relationship between church, us, community, parish, family, all that kind of stuff, and just trying to keep that clear and in front of us for a goal, maybe a little more than we have beforehand.
Yeah, and I think this sort of leads, because you would kind of touch on it. I think we all kind of touched on it a little bit, and I think it's something that so we had started off in the past. What do you think are the main causes of the crisis in the church? What is the crisis in the church? But then we got to move forward. But now let's kind of go back a little bit. And Andrew Mioni, I think you had a in your section of Faith in Crisis, you had actually raised a quite an interesting point of you kind of do a good job of talking about what the sort of the spiritual landscape was in the immediate lead up to the church, or to the council rather. And I think you raise an interesting point in your writings that I think a lot of people tends to view the crisis in the church as an institutional issue, when in reality it was a cultural issue and it was a personal issue. And I think a lot of the issues that have taken place in the church since the time of the council are obviously institutional. It's people like the leadership in the church, maybe not living up to what it should be doing. But I think part of the reason is because they've been a lot of the leaders and the leadership structures have imbibed a mindset, but a lot of it goes back to certain cultural views, certain issues on an individual level. And so what would you say are, like, how would you describe that set of issues? And maybe if you want to just briefly describe, because you had mentioned this a few times, of like, spiritual functionalism and functional spirituality. What was that? What were the specific sets of issues which because they seem like the kind of issues that we all know about, but they're very squishy and difficult to define. We all know it, right? And would you say that maybe the fact that this is the fatal flaw of Catholicism, is that we lean too much into the institutional element, so the issue isn't really so much like we tend to think too much in institutional terms when a lot of the issues go back to certain cultural and personal issues that the council is trying to fight against?
There's a lot I could say here, but I think I'll just say, you're onto something there that dual term that I coined of functional spirituality and spiritual functionality. So functional spirituality is kind of a checklist spirituality. It's what Pope Francis called a semi-Pelagianism of you go through the motions, you check the boxes, you do the things that you're supposed to do, you do the things that you're commanded to do, but more out of a sense of obligation. The Father Servais Pincares has a great book on that, on the morality of obligation, and how morality was kind of dictated by legal absolutes and not by aspirational what's the word I'm looking for? I guess just that one, just aspirations. So and then
like a teleological view, or
yeah, kind of, yeah. So it's more imposed from without than it is lived from within, if that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
very oversimplifying it, but that's kind of the gist of it. And then spiritual functionality, and I might have stretched the terms a bit here to make them fit nicely, but I think yeah, spiritual functionality is just reaching for function as the equivalent of your spiritual goal, right? So putting function and materialism and tangible, measurable, quantifiable things as your ultimate end goal. And when those two things are both present and intersect and weigh against each other, then then we're on some rocky ground. And so I think that to get back to your question on it, and speaking as someone who, and I don't say this in a critical way necessarily, but speaking as someone who was raised strictly in the traditionalist movement, and then kind of came into the wider church as a fully formed adult, I could definitely see the change in emphasis there, the change from kind of this very, I mean, I'll use the term like just scrupulous adherence to very tightly, neatly defined things, which again is not necessarily a bad thing. But then when that pivots to, we want you to understand the principles, we want you to understand the concepts, we want you to instead of being able to just memorize and recite the tenets of your faith, we want you to actually know them, right? So it's not a matter of, just to put it in a very, very simple example, it's not a matter of memorize these 5 catechism questions and repeat them back word for word. It's read this one paragraph from the catechism, think about it, study it, talk about it, pray about it, learn more about it, let it lead you to further research with the biblical citations and the references to church fathers and all this kind of stuff. There's a different emphasis, which I think both they both are necessary, they both need each other, and I think there was maybe and I'm guessing here because I'm born 20 years after or no, it was about 30 years after the council ended. And so, from what I understand, it was very heavily focused on the prior way, and then kind of switched to this new way very quickly and maybe very forcefully. And so I think it needs to kind of the pendulum needs to swing a little bit more in the middle, if that makes sense.
Well, forcefully the way a baseball hits a bat, but to speak your point, I think you brought up a very good one, and it does tell us, to me anyway, it's symptomatic of the pre-conciliar malaise. Was what came, on a smallish example, what transpired amongst the religious orders of women after World War II and leading up to the council. Now, you had a gigantic explosion of Catholic institutions, schools, hospitals, etc., 1945 to 1960. And the active orders of nuns to accommodate this and bring in, produce, for want of a better word, this is going to sound horrible, to produce more bodies, make more sisters quickly. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of those orders sort of cheapened, in a sense, their preparation. They reduced the amount of teaching they gave their novices and so on. So, for instance, one of the things about religious habits in those days was that they were all symbolic of one of two things: some spiritual teaching or whatever of the founder, or some historical event the order. That second sense are a lot like a regiment's battle flag. Well, let's say I'm making this up, but pretend, if you will, that this particular order always folds their cuffs like so. And this commemorates, I don't know, they're working with the wounded in the Franco-Prussian War. As the need to produce more nuns came along, they would tell them how to fold it, stop telling them the significance. And so, by the time the council came along, we had a lot of sisters and a lot of orders who were very resentful of what they considered meaningless, pointless rules. Now, they weren't meaningless and pointless, but they hadn't been taught the meaning of the point. And so, on orders like that, the council fell like, a ton of bricks. I was taught by the IHM, and they went crazy and absolutely mad. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, that's what happened. But that's, I think, in one little area, symptomatic of the problems of the church before the council. And it relates directly back to what you were saying. The trick is to make these things have meaning. Again, Mutatis Mutandis, there's a prayer in the British House of Lords that they say every day that epitomizes the whole of Catholic social teaching. It comes down from the Middle Ages. It's a beautiful prayer. It means absolutely nothing to them. And of course, you couldn't get away with it in a Catholic country because the government wouldn't accept it. But it's in so many things, the question is, can these bones live? Can we give meaning to the form, substance to the form? One answer is to simply get rid of the form entirely. Another is to say, well, just stick with the form and don't bother. We don't need any substance. We got the form. I think the trick is to have both.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think just to kind of focus in on traditionalists in specific, I think in some sense the traditionalist movement, I think, is a microcosm of a lot of things, because I think among traditionalists there's really two types, I think. And I think one of them is this sort of fanatical, sort of scrupulous, sort of like they're trying to continue the worst elements of the pre-Vatican II church. Like they want to, they think we're still living in the 1950s, but they're preserving like all the baggage of the 1950s. Whereas on the other hand, there's another subset of traditionalists. And ironically, I heard this is a quote, and I love this quote. But ironically, it comes from a guy who's a little bit more on the hardline side of the traditionalist movement. He's a guy named Michael Matt, who was, I think he's SSPX. He's the head of a traditionalist newspaper that I think has some connection to the SSPX. But he said, we don't actually want to return to the 1950s. We want to try to keep the Latin Mass, but we don't want to return to the 1950s, because the way things were in the 1950s is what led to a lot of the troubles that we're going through in the church today. It's like what we want to preserve is tradition and traditional ways of doing things, but not, I think, as Andrew would put it, this very mechanistic, this very shallow, legalistic, pharisaical approach to it. What we like now, of course, I think not everyone here would support the notion that we need to go back to the Latin Mass. Even I personally would. I believe, like, I like the Latin Mass. I think we should try to preserve the Latin Mass. I don't think it's pastorally prudent to suppress the Latin Mass, but I still believe that, the new Mass is valid and not necessarily bad or evil or dangerous in any way. But even with that in mind, I think the general spirit of what he's saying is true, that reform means preserving tradition, but it also means recognizing the distinction between tradition and the larger historical contingencies within which tradition was born, or within which it's lived, to be able to separate tradition from the less spiritually or morally productive elements of its historical context. And I think that's really pivotal. But again, I think that's the entire reason why I wanted to gather all of you here today is then this I think is like the last main point that I would like to discuss is what is obviously we need to have reform, but there's a lot of changes in the world, and reform is necessary insofar as we need to try to find better ways of implementing tradition. And so I guess the heart of the problem is we've talked about tradition, but I think now we need to define what is reform and how do we implement reform in the church. What do you think? What is reform? And so I guess maybe we could talk a little bit about that briefly, before and kind of putting in our last thoughts.
One point I'd like to make very quickly, and then I'll address it. Just Andrew, speaking of the hard line kind of traditionalists, one thing you've got to remember about traditionalists, especially older ones, oh my gosh, that's one of me, is that they're very much like adult abused children. When you're smacked around as a young person by the people you're trained to look to for help, it doesn't make you the nicest person when you get older. It doesn't make you very happy-go-lucky. It can make you kind of bitter and nasty. And then, of course, people ask, why is he bitter and nasty? Well, because he was smacked around by someone who shouldn't have smacked him around. So I'll just throw that out. But in my view, reform always has to mean accomplishing better, if possible, the main goal. That's reform. If I'm not accomplishing the goal that I'm set, or I'm not accomplishing it well, reform is somehow showing me a way to do it better than I was doing it to accomplish that goal. It's not altering the goal, because if that's the case, then you've got to do something else entirely different, and that's not reform, that's change into something else. But if you're going to accept that the goal is still important and still valid, then reform has to be seen in terms of accomplishing the goal in a better or more efficient manner. And that's what it seems to me. How to do it in the immediate with our particular case, frankly, I think Benedict was very much onto something. I think, frankly, that the last pontificate had a lot of deleterious effects in terms of what seemed to be a very promising project. I saw parishes that feature the traditional mass, and in every case, the Novus Ordo improved, not just in terms of its performance by the clerics, but more importantly, in my humble opinion, the reception by the people. And that, to me, that's reform. Not annoying people, not smacking them around, not poking them in the eyes and saying, you don't like that? How about this? To me, that's not reform. To me, that's poking the lion in the zoo with a stick, which, I mean, it may accomplish your goal, and if it does, then I guess it was reform. But the salvation of souls is what you're after. Annoying people for the sake of annoying them probably isn't it.
Yeah. And so let's go to Mr. Likoudis. Well, what do you see as being at the heart of reform, and what do you think is the general Catholic approach to reform, authentic reform that would have been promoted by the council or by church teaching more generally?
Well, I've been thinking about speaking up during this conversation a few times, but I think this kind of ties it in all together. More from a historical angle, I think we can all agree that there was a malaise before the council that needed to be remedied, and there was a lot of legalism and stuff like that. Vatican II, with your example of the guy looking for someone to give him confession, Charles, if the priest just turns him away and says, come back another time, that's not very pastoral. What I think Vatican II was trying to do was to make the church more pastoral, and that's why A lot of people bring it up that it's not a dogmatic council. It's all about the tone of the documents. It's exhortatory. It's trying to inspire people in a new way. It's not necessarily, in a lot of cases, it's not new teaching or new doctrine. It's old doctrine presented in a new way and applied. And so reform always deepens the substance of what came prior, but it might shed light on it from a new angle. Newman and St. Vincent of Lerins, well, St. John Henry Newman and St. Vincent of Lerins both give principles for what constitutes development of doctrine. I'm not going to rehash what those principles are, but they're a good guiding light for us. But I think we have to acknowledge that the council was called at the time it was because there was a lot of confusion in the world. Seismic changes were happening in society, and I don't think the church necessarily was able to sort of use kid gloves and say, like, we're going to implement this slowly, and be very, make sure everyone's catechized before we institute these changes. I think the church felt forced to have a top-down approach to some extent, which is kind of antithetical to the whole idea of collegiality developed at the council and synodality and all that. But I will say the changes of the world sort of forced the church to take action and take it quickly. So I don't know if you can necessarily blame the church or necessarily the world for that matter, because science progresses at the speed it does, and that's not something to blame someone for, or technology develops as fast as it does, and that's, you just have to roll with it, kind of. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Yeah, I'll start there. I had some other thoughts, but if they come back to me, I'll say them.
I was going to add in something. I think the question of proper reform, I'm probably above my pay grade exactly how that should go about. But I think one of the things that, so when I came back to the church, I spent about 2 years at a TLM, and it was amazing. I witnessed probably some of the most beautiful masses that I'll ever see. Hopefully not, hopefully I see some more that beautiful. But I think how do we carry on tradition? I think one of the things I realized was we can't place the small T traditions above the big T traditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, we've talked a lot about Pope Benedict. One of the things that I think both of the Andrews here were sort of influential in my own realization through a sort of group chat that we were part of, was a book by Pope Benedict called Call to Communion, where it mentions, communion with Christ and communion with the church, they're inseparable. So if you love the Latin Mass so much that you separate yourself from other Catholics or from the Pope, you've sort of gone too far on the small T. So if you accept that the new Mass is valid, right, the essentials are still there, the people still receive the sacrament, and right, it still saves souls, then you can't separate yourself from those group of Catholics that are right doing that. So I think, to me, that would be the beautiful part. I'd love to, the people that love more reverent masses, I'd love for them to have more influence, right, in the general church. But we almost, to Charles's point, I think it starts with like having the charity on both sides to be like, okay, those are good things that we can bring forward, but we can't choose those things that are the smaller T traditions over the larger T, right? Unity with our fellow Catholics, unity with the Pope, because then we're just like, I don't know, we're almost closer to the Orthodox or other, forms of Christianity. So that's the part, because the Orthodox, right, that's maybe a good point. They have an amazing like liturgy, like maybe even more beautiful, some people would argue, than the Latin Mass. But I'm not going to be Orthodox because I need to be in communion with the Pope, because I believe that's right.
You could be Eastern Catholic. Just thought I'd point
That's
that
true. That would be one way. That would be acceptable. But
Best of both worlds.
yeah, I really think people should read that book. It's a very short book by Pope Benedict XVI. And communion means so many things, right? Like communion with the Trinity, like the Eucharist itself, being in communion with the Church itself. And it's sort of a very deep thing that if you don't, and I think Pope Benedict just explains it really beautifully and profoundly. So,
yes. And of course, last but not least, Mr. Mioni, if you can just kind of maybe talk about your views on what is authentic reform, and how do we distinguish between authentic reform and not authentic reform, and what do you think are the best ways that reform can bring about renewal in tradition, and how do you think, what separates the renewal of tradition from the alteration or abandonment of tradition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll echo Bill in that this one might be a little above my pay grade, but I think just speaking from my own experience, authentic renewal, at least for myself, has come from, as I was saying earlier, taking facts that I know, taking things that I know, and delving deeper into it, and understanding the groundwork, understanding the foundations, right? So, for example, we can talk about so in the environment in the communities that I grew up in, there was a very intense fixation on like Marian prophecies and the rosary and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing at all, but when you understand the Mother of God strictly through that lens, and you've never read the biblical foundations for the Marian doctrine, when you don't understand all the biblical connections, between her and the Ark of the Covenant, and the groundwork, that's what you need to understand both things. I mean, one influences the other, right? So I think authentic reform doesn't take what is already there and shave it all away and say just let's change tack entirely and go over here. I think it acknowledges and respects and appreciates what is there already, and says, this is good, just don't exclusively focus on this. Don't exclusively focus on things that are external or that are based on repetition, or based on I don't want to say more superficial, because that's not the right word. Just don't make that the end all be all, right? Reform comes from really getting to the heart of things and understanding how it is we got to that in the first place, right? So in terms of, and this is just because it's the easiest topic to connect it to, but in terms of like reform of the liturgy, I mean, I'm not qualified to comment on what was the best or not the best for suggestions, but I think there was again, just based on my experience, there was a focus on, as long as these things are done in the right order, as long as these things are said in the right way, as long as these actions are done. I mean, when I was memorizing, and I was learning the responses for serving, low weekday mass, it was just, do I know the Latin words in the proper order, and can I recite them in that order? We didn't really talk about what they translated to, or what that meant, or where in the the prayers at the foot of the altar, that those are from scripture and what did that scripture mean? Why was that taken and put in the back? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I think, yeah, authentic reform respects and acknowledges what is there, but also says let's make sure we understand how it is we got here in the first place, and let's take the best of both worlds, I guess.
Yeah, and I would add, understand how those things fit into the bigger picture,
Yes.
and whether they still serve the salvation of souls. I do want to add a lot of Vatican II and developments around that time was about developing a more personal relationship with God, and I don't mean that in like the evangelical sense, like relationship over religion, but I do mean that like everyone has a unique call to holiness, and that requires discernment, and it's not just about following the church's prescriptions. That's like a neo-Pelagianism or a functionalism, but to be able to discern where God is calling you in your life, how you can serve the church. It was like, what talents has God given me? What awakens my heart? What inspires me? And finding out what God has personally given you, what gifts He's given you in regards to family, where you're placed in society, all of these little data points in your life that are God's way of communicating with you about, like, He's made you for a purpose in this particular historical moment with your particular historical instantiation of a person in this moment. So Vatican II placed a good deal of stress on the anthropological dimension. Some people like to criticize it as a turn away from God and toward man, but it's really it's more like we want to go further in retrieving the incarnational element of our faith. So there's no split between the horizontal and the vertical dimension, or nature and grace. They're both connected, and finding out how they fit together is something that I think Vatican II wanted to deal with.
I'd just like to point out that when I was in high school, 15, 16, we had a book called Christ Among Us, which was our doctrinal book. It was the most popular catechetical book for high school and above in the country at the time. 10 years after the time of my story, John Paul II unilaterally pulled the imprimatur off the thing. That's how bad it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I can honestly say it cost my class their faith. I'm just about the only one of that class who still goes to Mass. Now, I mention this for a reason. It was at that time that Cardinal McIntyre told me about the miracle of Lanciano, which, if you're not familiar with, it's the first Eucharistic miracle on record. And even more than in the days when it happened, our recent sciences have shown up all sorts of weird things about it. The point of my exercise, though, is that it hit me as I found out about it, that the Catholic Church, the Catholic truth, the Catholic doctrine is objectively true. It's real. And no attempt to cover it up or hide it or obscure it by human frailty, whether consciously or otherwise, can never succeed in the end. Because it's the only real thing we know for sure beyond anything else. I learned that when I was 16, and I've held on to it ever since. Now that I'm 65, it seems truer than it did then. Of course, there have been a lot of Eucharistic miracles, and not to make a plug, I wrote a book on the Holy and looked into it. But one of the things we must never lose sight of is the objective truth, the objective reality of the Catholic faith. It's something we have to submit ourselves to, not the other way around, which is what makes us different from, well, private judgment. And I faith. Every time, I've gone to several conferences and I see all these Catholic apostolates doing every imaginable thing you can imagine, from schooling to prisons to immigrants to on and on and on and on. Endless supply. And there always have been and there always will be. The faith will outlive all of our attempts, conscious or otherwise, to suppress her. And I think of Napoleon when he conquered Rome. He told one of the cardinals, I forgot which one, Consalvi maybe. Anyway, he said, I could suppress your church like that. And the cardinal looked at him and he said, we've been trying to do it for 1,500 years, or 1,800 years. We haven't succeeded. There's no way you're going to. And I think each of us who are Catholic, each of us who have that privilege, in a sense, that burden, as both Andrew said, as Bill said, we each of us have the obligation to carry that mission on in each of our lives according to where we've been put. Bill asked, what can one do? Never be afraid to invite friends to your kids, non-Catholic friends, to your christening parties and your confirmation parties and things like that, because they'll want to know why, and you'll get to explain it to them. My dad used to do that. There's a lot of good. He did it very well, I must say.
Yeah, and I think that's the number one thing is I would, go another step further and say that all truth is not only objective, it's supernatural at its base, because all truth comes from God and sort of reflects the glory of God. And so to encounter that which is at the root of all truth, whether in the spiritual or secular realm, is to encounter something divine and supernatural, and therefore to encounter something that transforms us. And once we've been transformed by the truth, we have this sort of boldness in the face of hardships and in the face of a culture that is radically out of step with our theological and spiritual mindset as Catholics. But that the presence of that doesn't disappoint us, because it only leads to the boldness of encountering God, and the joy that this brings will never leave us as long as we continue to cling to it. And I think that's sort of at the center of reform, because it's this, and why reform doesn't conflict with tradition, in my view, because tradition, I think, comes forth from that encounter with God, that transformative encounter with God, and a continuing openness to that is what allows us to adapt tradition to the needs of the modern world. And so I think that's sort of, what we all need to go forward, with, and it's with that we can always find new ways of proclaiming the gospel anew to a world that sort of desperately needs it. And so, and with that in mind, I think it would be good to sort of finish on that note. But again, I'd like to thank you all again for coming out. It was a pleasure talking to each one of you. It was a very enlightening and edifying discussion. Hopefully we can all gather again sometime soon to sort of have similar discussions. And, certainly this is a multifaceted topic and we could be up all night talking about it. But I would like to thank, each and every single one of you for agreeing to do this. This has been something that's been in the works for quite some time. And so I'd like to say, thank you again. And thank you for coming out. And God bless.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
Appreciate
you. Pleasure. God bless you.
Take care.